The Veltari fleet came out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system like a storm that had been building for 1,000 years. 300 warships dropped into real space one after another, their hulls dark and massive against the stars, their weapons already warm. They moved in tight formation, the way a predator moves when it already knows it has won. Their sensors swept the system from the outer planets inward, reading gravity wells, energy signatures, and electromagnetic noise. They found a small, warm planet sitting quietly in the habitable zone of an average yellow star. They found radio signals, some satellites, a few crude space stations in low orbit. They found what appeared to be a young civilization that had only just learned to leave its own atmosphere. Grand Admiral Velsaruth stood at the observation window of his flagship and looked at the distant dot of Earth. He had done this many times before. He had stood at windows like this one and looked at worlds that no longer existed, worlds he had personally ordered stripped of everything useful. 17 civilizations had looked up at his fleet and trembled. Some had tried to fight. None had succeeded. The Veltari Dominion had been the unchallenged power of the outer spiral arm for 11,000 years, and nothing in those 11,000 years had given Velsaruth any reason to believe this planet would be any different. He gave the order to broadcast the standard ultimatum. The message went out on all frequencies, translated into every language the Veltari scanners had pulled from Earth's radio transmissions. The terms were simple and had not changed in 11,000 years. Surrender all mineral and biological resources. Submit to cataloging. Evacuate the planet within 40 rotations. Failure to comply would result in a demonstration of force. The Dominion was not asking. The Dominion never asked. They sent the message and waited. On board the Earth Defense Coordination Vessel EDS Ironwall, sitting in a quiet orbit behind the dark side of the moon, a man named Cal Donahue read the incoming transmission on his console. He was not a tall man, not a particularly dramatic-looking one either. He had short brown hair, a plain face, and the kind of tired eyes that come from too many long shifts and not enough sleep. He read the message twice, set it down, and picked up his coffee. He drank about half of it. Then he leaned over to his tactical officer, a woman named Diane Harlow, who had already read the message and was watching him with a calm, steady expression. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think they've done this a lot," she said. "So have we," Cal replied. He pulled up the response console, typed a short message, and hit send. The message was calm. It was polite in the way that a closed door is polite. It told the Veltari fleet, in their own language, which humanity had been studying from intercepted signals and old wreckage for over 400 years, to turn around and leave the Sol system. It said this was not a request. The message reached the Veltari flagship within seconds. Velsaruth read it. He read it again. He handed it to his communications officer and asked if the translation was correct. The officer confirmed it was. The Grand Admiral was quiet for a long moment. In 11,000 years of expansion, no civilization had ever responded to the standard ultimatum with a counterorder. Most responded with silence, or panic, or a desperate and useless attempt at negotiation. None had ever told the Dominion to leave. He noted the response in his command log. Then he ordered a standard reconnaissance drone deployed into the inner system. The drone moved fast. It was small, nearly invisible, and equipped with the best sensor equipment the Dominion had. It transmitted for about 4 minutes before the signal stopped. Velsaruth looked at the empty feed. He ordered a second drone. That one lasted 2 minutes. A third drone was sent. It lasted 40 seconds. Back on the iron wall, Diane Harlow watched the intercept data on her screen and made a small note in her log. The drone kill systems had worked exactly as designed. The platforms were holding position perfectly. She glanced at Cal, who was finishing his coffee. "They sent a fourth one," she said. "I saw," he answered. "Do you want me to let it through this time? Let them see what we've built out there." Cal thought about it. He looked at his screen, then at the tactical display showing the Veltari fleet sitting fat and still at the edge of the system, 300 ships full of beings who had never once lost a fight. "No," he said. "Not yet. Let them wonder." The fourth drone disappeared like the others. What the Veltari could not see, and could not detect no matter how hard their sensors strained, was the shape of what humanity had been quietly building for 60 years. Kinetic platforms sat in the asteroid belt, cold and dark, designed to look like drifting rock. Railgun arrays were threaded through debris fields around the gas giants, powered down to the barest minimum to avoid heat signatures. Fast attack vessels ran in complete stealth in the deep outer system, their hulls coated in materials that scattered sensor beams the same way the dust clouds of space did. Everything was designed to look like nothing. Everything was designed to wait. This had been the plan since the very beginning. Since the day, 400 years ago, when the first alien ship had entered the Sol system uninvited and made the enormous mistake of assuming the small blue planet below it was undefended. That ship's crew had not survived. But their technology had been studied carefully, and their computer logs had been even more carefully decoded. Those logs had mentioned the Dominion. They had mentioned what the Dominion did to civilizations that were not ready. Humanity had decided, quietly and collectively, to be ready. In the 4 centuries that followed, Earth had gone through wars, plagues, famines, political collapses, climate disasters, and 3 separate moments where the entire species had come within a handful of bad decisions of wiping itself out. Through all of it, the preparation had continued. Governments changed. The project did not. Scientists died and were replaced by their students. Engineers retired and passed their work to younger hands. The knowledge of what was out there, and what it wanted, had been kept alive generation after generation, passed down not as a reason for fear but as a reason for work. And so they had worked. Now the Velthari fleet sat at the edge of the system, 4 drones short, and increasingly uncertain. In Velsaruth's command room, officers were running new calculations, new scans, new theories about what had happened to the drones. None of the theories were comforting. The planet below had no visible weapons platforms, no detectable fleet, no energy signatures that matched any known weapons system. And yet something in this system was cutting down Dominion technology with calm, efficient precision. Cal Donahue set his empty coffee cup on the console and pulled up the fleet overview. 300 ships. The largest force the Dominion typically deployed for a new acquisition. It was, by any historical measure, more than enough to handle any resistance a civilization at this stage of development could offer. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Diane Harlow looked over at him. "They've stopped sending drones," she said. "Good," Cal said. "That means they're thinking. Thinking is dangerous. Only if they figure out the right things to think about." He pulled up a secondary screen, checked the status of the outer system platforms, and nodded to himself. Everything was in position. Everything was ready. The Velthari fleet could sit there and think for as long as they liked. Humanity had been thinking about this moment for 400 years. They could afford to wait a little longer. Velsaruth did not like uncertainty. In 11,000 years of Dominion expansion, uncertainty had never been a problem. You arrived. You demonstrated power. The planet submitted. The process was clean, efficient, and deeply familiar. But this system was doing something no system had ever done before. It was making him wait. It was making him think. And the more he thought, the less comfortable he became. He called his senior officers together and listened to their reports. The drone losses were unexplained. Passive scans showed no weapons platforms, no defending fleet, no energy output consistent with military technology. The planet below was quiet. Its communications networks were busy with ordinary traffic, news, entertainment, financial data, personal messages, the kind of noise a civilian population made when it did not know it was being watched. Nothing suggested a military on high alert. Nothing suggested a species that knew what was coming. And yet 4 drones were gone. Velsaruth made a decision. Subtlety was a tool for uncertain situations, and he had spent too long in uncertain situations. He would demonstrate force directly. Not the full fleet, that was never necessary at this stage. He selected 40 ships, a forward strike group capable of leveling a continent, and ordered them toward the inner system. Their orders were simple. Find one city. Remove it from the map. Then wait for the response. A single demonstration had always been enough in the past. The strike group moved in formation, crossing the orbit of Mars in tight order, their weapons charged and their targeting systems active. They were scanning constantly, pushing their sensors as hard as the equipment allowed, watching for any sign of the threat that had taken the drones. They found nothing. Empty space. Cold rock. Background radiation. Then 12 of the 40 ships ceased to exist. There was no warning. No incoming fire that their sensors could track. No visible projectile, no energy beam, no explosion that followed any pattern their tactical systems recognized. 12 warships were simply there, and then they were not, torn apart in the span of a single second by impacts that registered as moving so fast the sensors barely caught them at all. The remaining 28 ships broke formation immediately, weapons firing in every direction, targeting systems screaming with confused data. They hit nothing. There was nothing to hit. 6 more ships died as they broke and scattered, caught by a second wave of impacts from a completely different vector. The last 22 ships broadcast emergency signals and burned hard for the main fleet, pushing their drives to the limit. Some made it. 14 of them did not. 8 ships limped back to the Veltari fleet with their hulls torn, their crews shaken, and no useful information about what had attacked them. Vel-Saruth listened to the survivor reports in complete silence. 40 ships. 8 returned. No confirmed visual contact with a single human vessel. No confirmed detection of any weapon system. His strike group had been taken apart like a student's homework by something that, according to every scan his fleet had run, did not exist. He sat in his command chair for a long time after the reports ended. "They are more advanced than our scans suggest," said one of his sub-admirals. "Their technology must be." "No," Vel-Saruth said. His voice was quiet and flat. "Their technology is not advanced. We have seen fragments of it in their broadcasts, in the materials their satellites are made from, in the design of their space stations. It is crude in many ways. Functional, but not sophisticated." "Then how?" "They prepared," he said. "That is all. They simply prepared." The word sat in the room like something heavy. His officers looked at each other and said nothing. In a low building in rural Montana, sitting before a wide holographic display that showed the entire inner solar system in real time, a woman named Grace Tillman was watching the last of the Veltari strike group limp back to their fleet. She had a cup of cold tea at her elbow and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a week with very little sleep. She was the director of Project Shepherd, the network that coordinated every hidden platform, every stealth vessel, and every defensive system humanity had spent 6 decades quietly building across the solar system. Beside her sat a man named Lou Ferrant. Lou was an engineer, the kind who spoke in numbers and tolerances and load calculations, the kind who got visibly uncomfortable when anyone used words like victory or triumph because those words implied a certainty about systems that he knew were always more complicated in practice than in theory. He had designed the kinetic platforms currently sitting invisibly across the inner system. He had run the numbers on their targeting systems more times than he could count. He watched the data from the engagement scroll across his screen and said nothing for a while. 40-8. Grace said quietly. "The platforms in Zone 3 underperformed slightly," Lou said. "I want to run a diagnostic on the targeting calibration before we use them again." Grace looked at him. "Lou, 40 ships went in. 8 came out." "I know. I'm just saying Zone 3 could do better." Grace almost smiled. She turned back to her display. The Veltari main fleet was still sitting at the edge of the system, 300 ships, unmoving. They would be reassessing now. Running new calculations. Trying to understand what had happened to their strike group. She had expected this. She had wargamed this exact moment hundreds of times over the years, in simulations, in planning sessions, in long late-night conversations with the engineers and scientists and military minds who had spent their careers preparing for it. What she had not fully predicted, though she had suspected it, was how calm she would feel. She pulled up a channel to the EDS iron wall and opened a line to Cal Donahue. His face appeared on her screen. He looked tired, the same tired he always looked, the kind that had become his natural resting expression after years of this work. "They pulled back," she said. "I noticed," he replied. "They're going to try something different next time." "Probably," Cal agreed. "What's your read?" Grace leaned back in her chair. "They'll try to locate the platforms before they move again. They'll run more scans, maybe deploy different sensor equipment. They might try a wider approach, come at us from multiple angles at once. Will they find anything? Not unless Lou's Zone 3 platforms start broadcasting their location." Lou, still looking at his diagnostic data, did not react. "We should be ready for a larger push," Grace said. "If they commit more ships to the next strike, we need to decide how we respond. Do we take the same approach, destroy, no contact, Let them stay confused, or do we show them something this time? Cal was quiet for a moment. What would showing them something accomplish? It would tell them we're choosing to be restrained, Grace said. Right now they don't know if we can't destroy the whole fleet or if we won't. That uncertainty is useful. But there might come a point where showing them we could destroy the whole fleet and are choosing not to sends a more powerful message. Cal thought about that. Not yet, he said finally. Let them keep guessing. The longer they're uncertain, the more time we have. Agreed. She closed the channel. On the display, the Veltari fleet remained still. 300 ships, perfectly intact, going nowhere. Full of beings who had never once in 11,000 years encountered a situation they did not control. Grace Tillman picked up her cold tea and looked at the display for a long time. She thought about all the people who had worked on this project before her. The ones who had decoded the first alien wreckage. The ones who had built the first platforms. The ones who had died before any of this was finished and trusted that someone else would carry it forward. She thought about all the generations that had looked up at the sky and known, quietly and without panic, that something out there would come eventually. It had come. And so far, humanity was handling it exactly the way they had always handled everything. One problem at a time. One system at a time. With patience, and work, and a very great deal of careful preparation. The Veltari fleet sat at the edge of the system and tried to understand what it was dealing with. It did not yet have the right answer. Nobody had asked Zelmaru to do it. That was the important thing to understand about what he had put together. His commanding officers were busy running new tactical assessments, redesigning skin protocols, and arguing about what kind of weapon system could have destroyed 40 warships without leaving a detectable energy trail. None of them had thought to look at the enemy the way Zelmaru was looking at them. From the inside. Zelmaru was young, by Veltari standards. He was a junior xenolinguist, which meant that in a military fleet his job was to help with translations when needed and otherwise stay out of the way of people who actually mattered. He had never seen a real battle before this posting. He had studied alien languages and communication structures in an academy on the Dominion's home world, and he had been assigned to this fleet the way a new tool gets packed into a kit, not because anyone had a specific plan for it, but because it might be useful at some point. He had been given access to Earth's open communication networks as part of his translation work. Those networks were vast. They carried everything: news, history, entertainment, science, argument, art, personal conversations, political debates, recordings of events going back centuries. The humans had been broadcasting freely into space for well over 100 years, and the Veltari fleet had been collecting those signals since long before this mission departed. The raw data filled enormous storage banks. Nobody had gone through most of it. Zelmaru started going through it. He started with history, because history told you what a species was made of. He found a great deal of it. The humans documented their past obsessively, not just the grand events, but the small ones too, the personal records, the journals, the letters, the photographs, the accounts from ordinary people describing what it had been like to live through the things their history books summarized in a few sentences. What he found there was not what he expected. He had expected to find a record of a species slowly advancing from primitive to civilized, the way most species did, wars becoming less frequent, violence declining, stability increasing as technology improved. That was the standard pattern. That was what the Dominion's historical records showed for most of the civilizations they had encountered. That was not what human history looked like. Human history looked like a species that had been in a continuous, grinding, relentless fight for survival against everything, including itself. They had fought each other across every continent, in every era, for every possible reason. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet and had kept those weapons ready for generations, pointed at each other, deterred from using them by calculations so complicated and fragile that historians had identified at least 11 separate moments where a single wrong decision would have triggered complete destruction. Each time, somehow, the wrong decision had not been made. They had survived plagues that killed a third of their total population in the span of a few years. They had survived a period of dramatic climate change that flooded coastal regions, shifted weather patterns, and caused widespread famine, and then spent 2 centuries deliberately repairing the damage. They had survived the impact of objects from space. They had survived ice ages. They had survived the collapse of agricultural systems, of governments, of entire economies. They had survived every single thing the universe had thrown at them and several things they had thrown at themselves. And every time they survived something, they studied it. They built institutions to make sure it would never catch them unprepared again. They developed fields of science dedicated entirely to identifying threats before those threats became crises. They created enormous archives of every mistake they had ever made and made sure those archives were accessible to anyone who wanted to learn from them. Zell-Maru read for days. He read about a virus that had killed hundreds of millions of people and the way the survivors had built global health systems in response. He read about the wars, too many to count, in too many places, for too many reasons, and the way each one had eventually produced new agreements, new structures, new understanding of what had gone wrong and how to prevent it next time. He read about the weapons capable of ending the world and the documents those weapons had produced, not treaties of surrender, but long and complicated agreements between groups that still hated each other, agreements built on the shared understanding that mutual destruction helped nobody. The humans had not become peaceful. They had become careful. There was a difference. They had taken every terrible thing that had ever happened to them and turned it into knowledge. They had an almost unnatural ability to look at catastrophe and ask, calmly, what they could learn from it. And then, buried in communications from approximately 400 years ago, Zell-Maru found references to an event that the humans called, in various accounts, the First Contact Incident. He dug for details. Most of the information was classified in their systems, access restricted, locked behind layers of security that even his decoding tools struggled with. But he found fragments. He found enough. A ship had come. Not human. It had entered the Sol system without warning or invitation, and it had not survived the encounter. The records were carefully vague about what exactly had happened, but the aftermath was documented in the changes to human institutions, the funding shifts, the language of certain government documents that mentioned, without specifics, the importance of readiness for encounters of an extraterrestrial nature. They had known something was out there for 400 years. They had been preparing since before anyone currently alive was born. Zell-Maru put his research together in a document. His hands were not entirely steady when he finished it. He read it through twice, then made his way through the ship to Velsaruth's command room. This was not a normal thing for a junior xenolinguist to do. He did it anyway. The Grand Admiral looked at him with the expression of someone who expected to be annoyed by the interruption. "Grand Admiral," Zell-Maru said, "I believe we have made a serious mistake." Velsaruth looked at the documents Zell-Maru placed in front of him and read through them slowly. His expression did not change much. It rarely did. But something in the set of his shoulder shifted slightly as he read, a small change that Zell-Maru noticed because he was watching carefully. "You believe this is accurate?" Velsaruth asked. "I believe this is incomplete," Zell-Maru said carefully. "I have only been able to access a fraction of their records. But the pattern is consistent across everything I have found. This species does not respond to threat the way other species do. They do not become paralyzed by it. They become organized." Velsaruth set the documents down. "How many of them are there?" "Approximately 10 billion on the home planet. And they have 17 colony installations on other worlds and in space. I have not been able to locate all of them." That detail landed in the quiet of the command room like a stone dropped into still water. 17 colonies, unlocated. 17 positions in space that the Dominion scanners had not found. Velsaruth was quiet for a long time. "They have been watching us since we arrived," Zell-Maru said. "Every drone we deployed. Every scan we ran. Every movement our fleet has made. I believe they have complete information about our position and our capabilities. I believe the destruction of the strike group was not a desperate act of defense. It was a demonstration. They were showing us a fraction of what they have, not all of it." He paused. "Grand Admiral, I do not think we wandered into the territory of a species that did not know we were coming. I think we wandered into a trap that has been building for 400 years. And I think the beings who built it have been waiting for us to arrive." Velsaruth looked at his tactical display. 300 ships. The greatest fleet the Dominion had deployed in 600 years. Surrounding a small blue planet that had, in the last 48 hours, destroyed 40 of those ships without a single one of his officers being able to explain how. For the first time in a very long career, Velsaruth had no immediate answer. Outside the flagship's hull, the stars were still. The Sol system waited, patient and quiet, the way it had always waited, full of cold dark space and hidden things, and a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how to survive everything. It had learned very well. Grace Tillman gave the order at 3 a.m, Mountain Time, on a Tuesday. There was nothing particularly dramatic about the moment. She was sitting at her usual station in the operations center, drinking water because the tea had run out 3 hours ago, and she had just finished reviewing the final readiness reports from the 12 fast attack vessels that had been running dark in the outer system for the past 9 days. They were ready. Their crews were ready. The platforms across the inner system were ready. Every piece of the plan that could be checked had been checked. She picked up the secure comm, opened a channel to all 12 vessel commanders, and said, "Execute Phase 2. Confirm on drop." One by one, 12 confirmations came back. Out in the dark of the outer solar system, 12 human ships simultaneously dropped their stealth fields. Their hulls stopped scattering sensor beams. Their heat signatures stopped mimicking background radiation. Their drive systems came to full power. For the first time since the Veltari fleet had arrived at the edge of the Sol system, there were human ships visible to Veltari sensors. 12 of them. Each one no larger than a Veltari frigate. Positioned at 12 different points surrounding the Veltari fleet at various distances, spread in a wide sphere that enclosed the 300 enemy warships from every direction. The Veltari fleet reacted immediately, the way a large animal reacts when it suddenly realizes it is surrounded, fast, loud, and not entirely coordinated. Weapons came online across the entire fleet in seconds. Targeting systems locked onto the 12 human ships with everything the Dominion's technology could bring to bear. Before a single shot was fired, a message went out from all 12 human vessels simultaneously. Same message, same timing, broadcast on every frequency the Veltari used, in the Velthari's own language. The message was from Cal Donahue. It said, "You have 72 hours to leave the Sol system. After that, we stop being polite." For exactly 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Veltari fleet opened fire. 300 warships firing in 12 different directions at once produced a volume of energy output that briefly registered on passive sensors clear out to the asteroid belt. The combined firepower of the Dominion's largest deployed fleet hit nothing. The 12 human ships were already moving, burning hard in directions and patterns that the Veltari targeting systems tracked, adjusted for, predicted, and then lost again, over and over, in a cycle that became more frustrating with each passing second. The evasion patterns had been designed by a team of mathematicians at the University of Chicago over a period of 11 years. They had been given one specific task, given everything known about Veltari targeting systems, derived from 4 centuries of captured data and reverse-engineered technology, build a movement model that those systems would consistently fail to predict. The mathematicians had gone through 14 major revisions of the model. The version currently running on the human ships was the 15th. It worked. The Veltari fleet fired for 6 straight minutes and hit nothing. Then the human ships stopped evading and went to work. What they did next was not, in the conventional sense, a battle. It did not look like a battle. It did not feel like one to the Veltari officers trying to process what was happening to their fleet. The 12 human vessels moved through the formation of 300 warships with a kind of calm, deliberate purpose that was more unsettling than any aggressive charge would have been. They targeted propulsion systems. They targeted communications arrays. They targeted sensor equipment. They did not fire randomly and they did not fire to destroy. Every shot was placed with precision at components whose loss would reduce what the fleet could do, its ability to move, to communicate, to see. Within 2 hours, a third of the Veltari fleet's communication links had been cut. Ships that had been operating as a coordinated unit were beginning to operate as confused individuals, unable to receive updated orders, unable to confirm the positions of their own allies. Within 4 hours, the fleet's sensor coverage had dropped to a fraction of its original capability. Large sections of space around them had gone dark from their perspective. They were firing into areas they could no longer see clearly, responding to position data that was already out of date by the time it reached the ships acting on it. Within 6 hours, the Veltari fleet, still 300 ships, still technically intact, still carrying enough firepower to end a civilization, was functionally blind, deaf, and deeply confused. Then the kinetic platforms fired. Grace watched the strike data roll across her display in real time. She had a headset on, one ear carrying the chatter from the fleet coordination network, the other listening to Lou Ferrant at the station beside her, who was calling out platform performance metrics in the quiet, precise voice of someone reading numbers off a gauge. The platforms did not fire at ships. They fired at the space around ships. A deliberate near-miss, carefully calculated, each impact close enough that the resulting debris and shock wave would register clearly on whatever Veltari sensors were still functioning. Close enough to destroy, if the next shot moved a few degrees. Far enough away to be, unmistakably, a choice. The message it sent was simple: this is what we can do. This is us choosing not to do it yet. Velsaruth, sitting in his command chair in a flagship that could no longer communicate clearly with more than a third of its own fleet, understood the message perfectly. He ordered a full stop. It was not a tactical stop, the kind an admiral orders when repositioning for a better angle. It was the other kind. The kind that means, we are no longer making moves. He sat very still and looked at a tactical display that was giving him incomplete and unreliable data, and he tried to think clearly through the specific and novel experience of being completely outmaneuvered by a species he had expected to harvest in 40 rotations. He opened a channel to every Veltari ship still capable of receiving communications and transmitted a single order: hold position. Do not fire. Hold position. In the Montana Operations Center, Grace Tillman pulled off her headset and set it on the console. She pressed her palms flat on the desk, took a slow breath, and let it out. All 12 vessels reporting no damage, said the technician at the coordination board. Platforms are standing by. Veltari fleet has stopped all movement. No weapons fire in the last 11 minutes. Grace nodded. She looked at the holographic display. 300 Veltari ships, sitting still, surrounded at a distance by 12 human ones. From above, the formation looked almost peaceful. It looked like a standoff. It was not a standoff. Standoffs were situations where both sides had equivalent leverage. This was something else. She opened a line to Cal Donahue. His face appeared on her screen. He looked exactly as tired as he always did, no more and no less. He had the slightly unfocused expression of someone who had been managing adrenaline for several hours and was now letting it drain out. Fleet is stopped, she said. I saw, he replied. They're going to want to talk. I know. Are we ready for that conversation? Cal thought about it for a moment, turning something over in his mind the way he always did before he answered a question he considered important. We've been ready for that conversation for 400 years, he said. The question is whether they're ready to have it honestly. And if they're not, then we have a second conversation, he said. A shorter one. Grace ended the call and turned back to her display. Outside the walls of the operations center, in the world above ground, it was 3:47 in the morning and the Montana sky was full of stars. Most people on Earth were asleep. Most of them did not know precisely what had been happening in the outer solar system over the past hours, though they knew something was happening. The news had been reporting on unusual military activity for days, careful reports that acknowledged the situation without revealing operational details. They would know soon. For now, Grace Tillman sat in her quiet room and watched 300 alien warships hold position in her solar system, stopped not by greater firepower but by the slow, patient, unstoppable logic of 4 centuries of careful work. Outside the flagship, in the dark, the 12 human ships held their own positions without moving. They could wait as long as necessary. They were very good at waiting. The negotiation lasted 9 days. It was conducted in a neutral space, a small, stripped-down shuttle bay on the EDS iron wall, cleared of equipment and set with a plain table and chairs on the human side, and a standing platform with a low rail on the Veltari side, because the Veltari did not sit in the way humans did. The air mix had been adjusted to something both species could breathe without discomfort. The lighting had been set to a level that did not give either side a headache. These were small things, practical things, and they had been planned for years in advance by a quiet department inside Project Shepherd that had spent decades thinking about exactly this kind of meeting. On the human side of the table sat 3 people. Grace Tillman was there because she had run Project Shepherd for 16 years and understood the full scope of humanity's position better than almost anyone alive. Cal Donahue was there as military advisor, present not to speak much but to be seen, a man who had been the voice of calm authority throughout the entire engagement, whose presence sent a clear and wordless signal about the kind of organization humanity was. And at the center of the table, in the chair directly across from Grand Admiral Velsaruth, sat a woman named Ruth Calder. Ruth was 63 years old, with close-cropped gray hair, reading glasses that she pushed up her nose habitually when she was thinking, and a voice that was pleasant and unhurried and carried the particular quality of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and had never once been rushed out of any of them. She had spent 30 years as a diplomat, negotiating agreements between parties who did not trust each other, and she had learned in that time that the most important thing in any negotiation was not to want it too much. If the other side could see how badly you needed the deal, they had leverage. Ruth had trained herself to need nothing, visibly. She could sit across from anyone, furious trade ministers, desperate heads of state, now a Veltari Grand Admiral who had overseen the extinction of 3 sapient species, and look as though she had nowhere else to be and no particular preference about how the conversation went. It drove people slightly crazy. That was often useful. Velsaruth arrived at the first session with 2 advisors and Zelmaru, whom he had started bringing to every command meeting since the young linguist had presented his research. He had not told Zelmaru why he kept including him. He did not entirely understand it himself, except that the junior officer seemed to see things that his more experienced advisors missed, and in the current situation, that quality had become more valuable than seniority. The first day was procedural. Ground rules. Communication protocols. The framework for how disagreements within the negotiation would be handled. Ruth moved through it all at a pace that allowed no rushing and no stalling, a rhythm she established in the first hour and maintained throughout. Velsaruth spent much of the first day watching her. He was trying to find the angle, the need, the weakness, the thing she was protecting or the thing she was reaching for. He was very good at reading negotiators. He had dealt with them before, in the handful of cases where a civilization had tried to bargain rather than submit immediately. They always had something visible that they were afraid of losing. It was usually the first place he applied pressure. He could not find Ruth's thing. On the second day, he asked her directly, "What does humanity want from this negotiation?" Ruth looked at him over her glasses. "I'd rather not compress it into a single sentence," she said, "because single sentences tend to leave out important context. But the short version is, we want the shooting to stop, we want the Dominion to stop expanding into this arm of the galaxy, and we want to talk about the status of the civilizations you currently control." Velsaruth waited for the rest of it. "And," he said. "And that's it," Ruth said. He studied her face. "You have my fleet at a disadvantage. You could demand technology transfers, resource rights, territorial concessions across Dominion space. You could demand considerably more than what you have described." "We could," Ruth agreed. "Why don't you?" Ruth set her pen down and thought for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she wanted to give him an accurate one rather than a diplomatic one. "Because we don't need what you have," she said. "We need the shooting to stop. We need the civilizations your Dominion has been consuming to have a chance to recover and exist on their own terms. That is the goal. Not your ships, not your territory, not access to your technology. We are not interested in building an empire. We are interested in building a stable situation." Velsaruth looked at her for a long time. "Every species says that," he said. "Every species that has ever stood across from the Dominion in any kind of formal exchange has said some version of that. We want only peace. We want only stability." "And what did those species do afterward?" Ruth asked. He did not answer that. "We're not like the species you've met before," Ruth said, not unkindly. "Not because we're morally superior, I would not make that argument, given the history I'd have to defend to support it. But because we're not frightened of you. The civilizations you've encountered before were in your shadow. They were negotiating from a position of terror, and terror makes people say whatever they think will keep them alive in the moment. We are not saying these things because we are afraid. We are saying them because they are what we actually want. That changes what the words mean." Zelmaru, in his corner, was writing. He wrote, "They are not performing confidence. They simply have it." The days that followed were detailed and sometimes difficult. There were sessions where Velsaruth's advisors pushed back on specific terms, and Ruth pushed back on the pushback, and Grace occasionally entered the conversation with a piece of information or a data point that redirected the discussion in a way that was clearly deliberate, though always framed as helpful clarification. Cal Donahue spoke rarely. When he did speak, both sides of the table listened. He had a quality that was hard to describe, not authority exactly, but a kind of settled weight, the presence of someone who had made all the decisions he needed to make before entering the room and had nothing left to be uncertain about. On the sixth day, the question of the 17 civilizations under Dominion control became the central point of argument. Velsaruth's advisors argued that the internal arrangements of the Dominion were not a matter for outside negotiation. Ruth replied, in a tone that was pleasant and completely unmovable, that they were going to be discussed anyway, so the question was only whether the Dominion wanted to be involved in shaping those discussions or wanted to leave the outcome to humanity's unilateral judgment. It took 3 more days to work through it. The final agreement included a cessation of Dominion expansion in the galactic arm, a mutual exchange of navigational charts, and the establishment of a formal review process for the subjugated civilizations, not a guarantee of independence, not immediately, but a structured process with defined stages and outside oversight. It was not a perfect agreement. Ruth knew that. Grace knew it. Even Cal, who did not generally deal in perfection, knew it. But it was a real one, with teeth in it, and it was more than any of those 17 civilizations had ever had before. On the final morning, before the documents were signed, Velsaruth sat across from Ruth in the quiet of the shuttle bay and said, "I have a question. Not a formal one. A personal one." Ruth waited. "The man, Donahue, at the very beginning, when we first arrived. When he sent us that message and told us to turn around. Did he know then that this is how it would end?" Ruth thought about it. "I'll let him answer that," she said. That evening, after the signing, Velsaruth sent a private message to Cal Donahue through the communication channel they had been using throughout the negotiation. It said, "Did you know, at the beginning, that you would win?" Cal read it. He sat with it for a while, holding his coffee cup in both hands, staring at the words. Then he typed back. "We've been losing and winning for 10,000 years. We don't really think in those terms anymore. We just think about what we're going to do next." He sent the message and finished his coffee. The next morning, the Veltari fleet turned. 300 ships, slowly, one section at a time, pointing their hulls away from Earth and toward the deep space beyond the system's edge. Their drives came up gradually, a long, slow acceleration that would carry them back the way they had come. It took hours for the full fleet to get underway. Grace watched it happen on her display from Montana. Lou Ferrant sat beside her, running a last check on the platform systems, making notes about what needed maintenance now that the immediate emergency was over. "Zone 3 platforms still need the calibration," he said. "I know, Lou," Grace said. She watched the Veltari fleet grow smaller on the display, growing dimmer as the distance increased, 300 lights moving slowly toward the dark. Zelmaru, in his cabin on the flagship, was still writing. He wrote long after the planet had disappeared from the fleet's sensors, filling page after page with everything he had seen and heard and understood. He knew, without anyone telling him, that what he was writing would matter. Not today, perhaps not for years. But eventually. The Dominion had met something it had never encountered before, and the record of that meeting needed to exist, needed to be clear and honest and complete. He wrote, "They looked at us the way you look at a problem that has finally arrived, and that you have been ready for a very long time." Back in the Sol system, the hidden platforms returned to their cold, patient orbits. The 12 fast attack vessels went dark again, disappearing back into the empty space between the planets as though they had never been there. The stars were quiet. Humanity turned back to its work. There was, as always, more to do.